Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's video on the topic of genetics. This week we'll be covering the basic patterns of human inheritance and also complex patterns of inheritance. I suggest you do the following while watching this video. First, follow along in the book. The chapter and section numbers are at the top of the slides. Second, pause the video when necessary to find your place in the book, to listen again to something you didn't understand, or to work on one of the example problems. Okay, recessive genetic disorders. A recessive trait is expressed, or in other words, the recessive trait is seen in an organism when the individual is homozygous for the recessive trait. Homozygous means they have to have both of their genes are the recessive trait. Otherwise, you won't see the recessive trait. Now, some examples of these which we're going to look at in the next couple minutes are cystic fibrosis, albinism, galactosemia, and Tay-Sachs disease. Cystic fibrosis. This affects the mucus-producing glands, the digestive enzymes, and the sweat glands. Chloride ions are not absorbed into the cells of a person with this disease, but are excreted in the sweat. And without sufficient chloride ions in the cells, a thick mucus is secreted. This mucus builds up in their lungs, and they need help to get it out of their lungs because if they don't, they'll literally suffocate in their own mucus. Albinism. It's caused by altered genes, resulting in the absence of the skin pigment melanin in hair and eyes. These people, regardless of race, have white hair, very pale skin, and pink pupils, because literally what you're seeing are the blood vessels in the back of their eyes. Tay-Sachs disease. This is caused by the absence of the enzymes responsible for breaking down fatty acids called gangliosides. Gangliosides accumulate in the brain. They inflate the brain's nerve cells and cause mental deterioration. Galactosemia. This is a recessive genetic disorder characterized by the inability to digest the sugar galactose. Now, those are recessive disorders in which you have to have both recessive genes. Some dominant genetic disorders, where you only need one dominant gene in order to have the disorder, are Huntington's disease, which affects the nervous system. Achondroplasia, also known as dwarfism, is a genetic condition that causes small body size and limbs that are comparatively short. And this table shows you that 1 in 10,000 people have Huntington's disease in the United States, and 1 in 25,000 people have achondroplasia. This table's in the book. Also, this table as well is in the book. Okay, now, when we look at basic patterns of human inheritance, we can use a pedigree, which is a diagram that traces the inheritance of a particular trait through several generations. And the reason why we would use this diagram is to try to predict who might have the disease and who might be carriers of the disease, so that they can make informed decisions when having children. As you can see down below, on the right, it shows the first generation. Squares are males, circles are females. If they're orange in color, completely orange, they're normal. They don't have the trait. If they're half and half, it means that one of their alleles is the trait. And if they're completely burgundy or maroon, what do you want to call that color, then it means they have both. Both of their alleles is the trait, the disease trait. Okay, now knowing a physical trait you can infer what the genotype is or what it's most likely to be. If it's a dominant trait, then they have to either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. If they have the recessive trait, then they must be both recessive genes. So you can infer a genotype, or at least get it down to a few possibilities, by knowing what the physical characteristics are. And you can predict disorders by using record keeping, because this helps scientists analyze inheritance using pedigrees and looking at the patterns, determining the phenotypes, and to figure out what the genotypes must be. All right, now we're moving on to a different area and looking at the subject of complex patterns of inheritance. Everything we looked at so far was simply dominant and recessive. Okay, if you have the dominant gene, you have the dominant trait. If you're missing the dominant gene on both alleles, then you have the recessive trait. There are exceptions though. For instance, incomplete dominance. This is when the trait only partially dominates, and you can get a mixture of two traits. It says here on the slide, the heterozygous phenotype, or in other words, when the individual has two different genes for that trait, is halfway in between. They show red and a light blue flower. In the diagram, red is the capital R, blue is the small r, and when someone is heterozygous for the trait, instead of having the red color, in this case now they have a purple color, a mixture of the red and the blue traits. Codominance. Instead of seeing a mixture of the traits, both alleles are expressed in the heterozygous condition. So an example that would be sickle cell disease. Another example might be, let's say, two rabbits. You had a white rabbit and a black rabbit, and they produced offspring. If the trait for black and the trait for white were codominant, we would see an animal with areas of black and areas of white. Okay, maybe it'd be spotted, but we would see both colors. Now, the way that's different than incomplete dominance is that if it was incomplete dominance, then the offspring would be gray in color, a mixture of black and white. Now, sickle cell disease causes changes in hemoglobin, and these hemoglobin causes the blood cells to be sickle in shape. This sickle shape makes it harder to flow through arteries and small little tiny vessels like capillaries, and they can become clogged with the red blood cells, and it's quite painful. People who have one allele for the trait have a moderate case of disease. Okay. Half of their cells are normal, half of their cells are sickle. People who have both alleles for the disease have very severe cases of sickle cell anemia. All of their cells form sickles. Another complex pattern of inheritance is multiple alleles. Blood type is an example of this. You can actually have 3 different alleles: the A allele, the B allele, and the O allele. If you have either the A or the B, those two are both dominant over O, but they don't dominate over each other. So that is why somebody can be AB, B or A. In order to be O type, you have the person has to have both alleles being the O type, since it is recessive. And what's interesting though is that is the majority of people do have type O. So even though it's recessive, it is the most common trait. Okay, now we're just talking about rabbits. Multiple alleles can also happen in rabbits in terms of coat color. Rabbits can have 4 different alleles. Okay, C, big C, little CCH, little CH, and C. Okay. Another complex pattern of inheritance is sex determination. These involve entire chromosomes, the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. Males have an X and a Y. Females only have X's. The X chromosome carries a variety of genes that are necessary for the development of both males and females. However, the Y chromosome mainly has genes that relate to the development of male characteristics. In females, one X chromosome is inactivated in each cell. The inactivated X chromosome is visible in stained cells as something called a Barr body. Sex-linked traits are genes located on the X chromosome. Some examples of this are red-green color blindness and hemophilia. If a person has the recessive trait, there is no dominant trait. There is no X. Okay, a male, in other words, a male only needs one gene. Since they only have one X chromosome, they only need one hemophilia allele to have the disease. And finally, our last trait we're going to look at, our last pattern of inheritance, I should say, are polygenic traits. Okay, the word poly, poly means many, genic referring to genes. These traits arise from the interaction of multiple pairs of genes. So it's not just one set of alleles. There are several sets of alleles involved in polygenic traits. Some other things that can affect whether a trait is expressed in an individual are environmental factors. Diet and exercise, sunlight and water, and temperature can all affect whether a trait is expressed. And it's been very useful. Scientists have used twin studies to help separate genetic contributions from environmental contributions. Or in other words, they look at twins who were separated at birth. And did they both develop the same traits regardless of whether they had contact with each other or not in very different environments? And traits that appear frequently in identical twins are at least partially controlled by heredity. And these traits expressed differently in identical twins are strongly influenced by environment. So in other words, there are some traits that almost always are determined by heredity, but it's helped scientists understand that there are some traits that are more influenced by the environment that the organism is in.